She walked into the courthouse expecting justice. What she got was humiliation, silence, and a buzzing razor meant to strip her identity. But what they didn't know was that the woman they detained, mocked, and shaved was the very judge set to preside over the case that would put their entire department on trial. This wasn't just a story about abuse. It was about what happens when the courtroom becomes the crime scene and the verdict rises not in fury, but in silence, sharp enough to cut policy in half. If you think this ends with a gavel, you're only half right. The real judgment hasn't even begun. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. On that brittle morning in Lexington, the air was all stillness and cold metal. The sun hadn't yet touched the plaza stone, and the doors of justice stood like sentinels guarding something not sacred, but suspicious. Judge Emidia Rhodes, wrapped in navy wool, walked through that stillness like she owned it. Because she did. But the badge clipped inside her case was invisible to the men who watched her. To them, her silver curls were not styled, they were suspect. Her silence wasn't strength, it was defiance. And as she passed through the scanner, the buzz wasn't mechanical. It was prophetic. What followed wasn't protocol, it was punishment. Deputy Colton Briggs moved like authority, without leash or logic. "Step out of line," he barked. But it wasn't a request, it was a verdict before trial. Imani paused, not from fear but from calculation. He wanted reaction. She gave him none. She reached slowly into her coat and held out the federal judiciary badge. He took it like he was taking candy from a child, not evidence from a judge. The badge vanished into his pocket like her dignity was up for evaluation. Then came the back room, then the clippers, then the Snickers. "Standard procedure," he said. "You could be hiding something in that curly little mop." With each buzz, pieces of her fell, not just hair, but history. And still she sat, not because she consented, because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She moved like a glacier, slow, unstoppable, and cold with truth. That chair they shoved her into was a throne in disguise, and though they stripped her head, they couldn't touch her crown. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was a verdict still loading. Inside, she was replaying every moment, every officer who stood idle, every smirk, every slur wrapped in faux formality. No one asked questions. No one checked the badge. And in that room, soundproof by design, the loudest thing was silence. Not the absence of noise, the absence of courage. She stared straight ahead, fists clenched, heart steady. She was not waiting to be saved. She was gathering names. Briggs overplayed his hand the moment he called her sweetheart, the moment he touched her arm like it belonged to him. It wasn't that he made a mistake. It was that he believed it wasn't one. That belief, the quiet hum of entitlement, was what burned. She was escorted back down the hallway, with hair like ash in her wake, as if justice had been cremated behind closed doors. No one stopped her, no one helped. The younger officer shifted nervously, eyes darting to the floor. The hallway was a museum of cowards. She walked through it, head uncovered, eyes forward. Her robe wasn't on her shoulders, but it was waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment came. The courtroom rose not with instruction, but instinct. The woman who entered was bare, bruised, and undeniable. She picked up her robe like armor, like resurrection, slid it over her shoulders, and stepped to the bench. Across the room, Briggs stood like a boy caught cheating on an open-book test. She didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the courtroom, and in that pause before her first word fell like a gavel, you could feel it. Justice wasn't always loud, but it had finally cleared its throat. The courtroom hadn't yet caught its breath when the truth of who she was began to settle like smoke in the rafters. No grand announcement, no bang of a gavel, just a presence. Judge Imani Rhodes didn't need to demand order. Her entrance had already stolen it. She stood taller than the bench, taller than the law itself in that moment, and across the room Deputy Briggs began to shrink. Not physically, but his authority, his confidence, his posture, it all folded inward like paper caught in rain. He didn't blink as the realization hit him, but everyone else did. The woman he'd dragged, mocked, and violated was the very soul of the courtroom he thought he ran. Her voice, now amplified by silence, didn't just command attention, it pressed weight onto the very floorboards. Every word she uttered wasn't a statement, it was evidence. The first witness called was Joseph Banner, a retired Army vet with a brace on one wrist and an old limp that spoke before he ever opened his mouth. He had survived deployments, battlefields, the sound of incoming fire. But what cracked him wasn't combat. It was concrete, cracked ribs, and being told to stop faking it by a man paid to serve and protect. "I bled for this country," he said, voice rough as gravel. "But I was broken by a badge back home." The room didn't gasp. It absorbed. And in that stillness something else formed. Anger, sure, but something more precise. Recognition. He wasn't alone. His pain mirrored others. Across the gallery, people nodded, not in sympathy, but in solidarity. The truth was no longer isolated. It was now a witness in itself. When Briggs was called to the floor, his steps were slow, heavy, as though gravity had been doubled just for him. He stood like a man remembering every bad choice at once. Judge Rodas didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "How many women have you dragged without cause?" she asked. No flourish. Just a blade, clean and sharp. He sputtered. I didn't realize I was a judge. What if I hadn't been?" She countered. "Would that make it acceptable? Did my robe grant me humanity?" Her words came like a scalpel, dissecting not just his behavior, but the culture that bred it. "You wore that badge like a shield, but you used it like a blade, and every cut has a record. 12 complaints. Dismissed. Because none of them had a bench to sit behind. Until now." Briggs didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence answered for him. Then came the shift no one saw coming. Not from her, but from the world outside that had started to listen. A federal officer entered the courtroom during recess. Crisp suit, clipped tone, holding a sealed envelope like it weighed more than any briefcase ever could. The Department of Justice was watching now. Not just Lexington. Not just local oversight. The courthouse had become a national case study in silence, power, and what happens when someone finally says, "Enough." The envelope wasn't just paper, it was potential. Briggs wasn't just suspended. He was under federal review, and for once, procedure would work in the direction of justice. When the agent handed it over, he whispered, "This isn't just about you anymore." And she whispered back, "It never was." Imani didn't celebrate. She didn't smirk. Because this wasn't about victory. It was about prevention. She hadn't come back to destroy Briggs. She came back to build a firewall around every woman who would come after her, around every voice that might one day tremble instead of testify. The system didn't shake because she shouted. It shook because she stayed. And as Briggs was led out of the courtroom, the look on her face said everything her words didn't need to. She didn't want him fired. She wanted the next her spared. The city of Lexington didn't erupt. It inhaled and never exhaled. The day after the courtroom thundered with silence, something shifted in the streets. Not a protest, presence. Elderly women in church hats stood at the courthouse steps, gripping purses like anchors, tears slipping down cheeks, weathered by decades of waiting for a moment like this. Teenagers lined the sidewalks, hoodies up, eyes locked, daring the world to look away. And in between them, everyday folks. The mailman, the teacher, the nurse from the clinic down the block, stood shoulder to shoulder, without a chant, without a sign, but with a message. This wasn't noise. This was acknowledgement. The silence that once protected abusers now wrapped around the truth like insulation. The crowd wasn't loud because it didn't need to be. It had finally been heard. Inside the courthouse, the air felt different. Jasmine moved through the hallway, slower now, her eyes no longer darting, just watching. Yesterday she filed, today she remembered. Her clipboard didn't feel like paperwork anymore. It felt like witness. And Sandra Kerr, the records clerk who had been logging complaints into oblivion for 20 years, finally saw her job for what it could be. She sat at her desk with trembling fingers, opening old folders, tracing signatures she once passed without thought. "I filed the complaints," she whispered. "I just didn't follow them." That realization didn't shatter her. It reformed her. Sandra had followed paper trails all her life, Jasmine would later say, but this was the first one that led to truth. Jasmine saw it too. This wasn't just a judge reclaiming a bench, it was a building remembering its purpose. And she, a young black clerk with bright eyes and bolder ideas, now had something she didn't have yesterday: direction. The knock came just after noon. Sharp, sure, but not aggressive. Jasmine opened the door to a federal agent in a tailored gray suit, with eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. He carried a manila envelope under one arm and the air of someone who knew the difference between a policy and a lifeline. "We've been watching," he said, "from Washington." He didn't flash a badge. He didn't need to. His voice had weight. "Judge Rodess hasn't just shaken a courtroom. She's stirred the department." There was no press conference, no media circus, just a quiet exchange behind closed doors that shifted the course of the building's future. "You didn't scream," he said softly to Imani, "and that's why they're listening." It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. History doesn't always shout. It hinges. Later that evening, the clip hit the internet like a match to dry leaves. It was only 94 seconds long, but it burned through denial faster than any speech could. Imani walking into the courtroom, her scalp bare, her back straight. No music, no edits, just raw authority. Then the moment she took her seat behind the bench and began to speak. "This courtroom will no longer be a fortress. It will be a mirror." That line didn't go viral because it was catchy. It went viral because it was needed. Every screen, every feed, every thread had her face on it. Not as a victim, as a verdict. The comments didn't debate her. They echoed her. This time, one user wrote, "The video didn't show someone falling, it showed someone standing. And for the first time in a long time, the world paused, not to mourn, but to learn." The trial didn't start with fireworks. It began with precision. The bench didn't creak. It groaned with memory. Every file placed on the judge's desk thudded like a chapter of testimony the building had tried to forget. The courtroom wasn't full of emotion, it was full of record. Security logs that contradicted reports, timestamps that erased lies, complaint forms signed and shelved like bureaucratic apologies. Imani sat high behind the bench, not armored in indignation, but focused with surgical calm. The defense spoke with clipped tones and sanitized language. "Unfortunate misunderstanding," they said. "Standard procedure misapplied." But the documents said otherwise. One by one, they landed like fists. Pages didn't cry. They accused. Danielle Brooks took the stand mid-morning. She wasn't just a witness. She was a reflection. A black nurse, a mother, a survivor of a different badge in a different hallway. Her eyes didn't tremble when she looked at the defense table. Her hands didn't shake when she adjusted the microphone. "I didn't scream for me," she said slowly. "I screamed because he couldn't breathe." The courtroom leaned in. It wasn't the kind of testimony you highlight on cable news. It was too honest for that. She recounted how her son, asthmatic, sat in a locked car while officers questioned her like a suspect, instead of a nurse. Her words didn't need embellishment. They pulsed with lived weight. She didn't cry. She testified. And every sentence sounded like it belonged in a transcript. but echoed like a eulogy for a system that still hadn't learned how to see her. When the jury returned, the air turned to glass. No one coughed, no one shuffled, just a list of charges, and beside each one a single word: guilty. No overacting, no outbursts, just silence so thick you could hear it thinking. The defendants didn't shout, they slumped. The courtroom didn't cheer, it exhaled. One woman in the back clutched her purse to her chest like a Bible. A young clerk blinked away the sting behind her glasses, and Imani, still seated at the bench, didn't move. She didn't smile, she just nodded once. Slowly, like a clock hand marking the moment something ended, and something else began. They weren't sentenced by evidence alone, they were sentenced by echoes. Echoes of names dismissed, complaints ignored, faces forgotten. Outside, the sky hung heavy with clouds, but no one left. The crowd was still there, still silent. They didn't raise their fists or wave banners. They bore witness. A grandmother held a laminated photo of her nephew, arrested 5 years ago for a noise complaint that turned into a fractured jaw. A teenage girl with tight braids and a hard stare stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes unblinking. The city wasn't roaring, it was remembering. People didn't come to celebrate a win. They came to acknowledge a wound. The courthouse steps weren't a podium, they were a confessional. And when the doors opened and Imani emerged in her black robe, she didn't stop, she didn't wave, she just walked down those steps like a verdict on 2 feet. That day wasn't about revenge, it was about recognition. It was about truth being spoken in a register too clear to ignore. The law didn't raise its voice, it stood up. And for the first time in a long time, the people of Lexington stood with it. Not behind, not beneath, but beside. Accountability didn't need applause, it needed eye contact. And this city, this courthouse, these people, they finally gave it. Jalen Carter was 10 years old when he recorded history, not the kind in textbooks, but the kind that rewrites policies. One voice memo, one trembling hand under a hoodie, and a digital file that couldn't be unheard. That recording didn't just convict 2 officers, it convicted the silence they relied on. And because of that, the Jalen Carter Act passed unanimously in the Lexington City Council chambers just 3 months later. Body cameras, mandatory on all personnel, tampering or disabling them, automatic criminal charges. Independent civilian reviews for every incident involving force. It wasn't just law, it was acknowledgement. Yellen didn't speak at the press conference. He didn't need to. His face, his breath, his voice saying, "Mom, I can't," it had already done the speaking. He didn't just press record. He pressed pause on unchecked power. And he taught a city that even a kid can be the emergency line justice needed. Danielle Brooks didn't plan on becoming a public figure. She didn't want press, didn't crave authority. But the city wanted more than apologies. It wanted eyes, real eyes, on power. That's how she found herself sitting in the first meeting of the newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee, a clipboard in one hand and her old nursing badge in the other. Her voice didn't rise above the others, but when she spoke, even the mayor leaned in. "I didn't want this job," she told the room. "I wanted no one else to need it." Her presence reminded people that oversight isn't a task, it's a testimony, and every time a complaint came across her desk, she read it like it had her son's name on it, not as a bureaucrat, as a mother who once had to choose between de-escalation and her child's last breath. Meanwhile, in a courtroom that looked almost identical to the one Imani had transformed, Briggs and Doyle sat without uniforms. No badges, no belts, just orange jumpsuits and the dead weight of consequence. The judge this time wasn't poetic. He didn't need to be. The facts spoke loud enough. Multiple counts: abuse of authority, assault, obstruction, child endangerment. Their lawyers asked for leniency. Their former colleagues didn't show. And when the sentences came, 10 years for Doyle, 12 for Briggs, it wasn't just years behind bars they received. It was a severance from the identity they once weaponized. They didn't lose careers. They lost camouflage. The courtroom didn't applaud. But outside, someone taped a photo of Danielle and Jalin to the precinct's front door. No words, just the image. Just a reminder, we saw you, and we remember. For those who followed this story, who sat with the discomfort, the fury, the grief, this part is for you. Because justice isn't just a hammer, sometimes it's a mirror. The kind that shows you how close you've stood to indifference. The kind that dares you not to look away. If you've made it this far, you've seen what happens when people stop waiting for someone else to do something. You've seen a boy change the law with a whisper. You've seen a mother hold the system accountable without raising her voice. You've seen what happens when kindness doesn't mean softness, when it means refusing to look away. So, share this story, not for tears, but for mirrors. Someone out there needs to see themselves in this and remember they're not powerless. They're just getting started. Time passed, but it didn't erase. It refined. It didn't cool the fire. It taught it how to warm instead of burn. Judge Imani Rodess walked through the same federal courthouse doors exactly 1 year to the day since Briggs dragged her from that same threshold. No cameras waited this time, no protests, just the usual clatter of court traffic and the quiet rustle of papers in long hallways. She wore her robe again, not because it shielded her, but because it reminded others. She wasn't the judge who had been assaulted. She was the judge who came back. And she didn't return to make headlines, she returned to make habits. Because real reform doesn't happen with eruptions. It happens with relentless repetition. Every case heard fairly, every voice logged properly, every person seen fully. That's what changes things. Not rage, but return. The bench hadn't forgotten her, but now it stood for more than law. It stood for healing. Jalin never once said he wanted to be a cop. Not after everything. Not after the courtroom, the sirens, the whisper of handcuffs on his mother's wrists. But he also didn't retreat. He didn't shut down. He got quieter, but not smaller. He joined the school's media club, learned to hold a mic, learned how to ask questions that made people pause. "What does respect look like to you?" he'd ask in interviews. "Had you ever been afraid of someone with power?" He didn't call it activism, he called it curiosity. But what he really built was a mirror, one he held up to every adult who had ever looked past him. He didn't want to be a uniform, he wanted to be a reminder. That one voice, even a small one, can change the temperature of an entire city. Jalin didn't need a badge, he had a legacy. One rainy Friday, long after the hearings and headlines faded, Imani visited a young girl who had testified in one of the bias cases. The child sat alone in the waiting room, legs swinging off the edge of a hard bench, fingers worrying the corner of a folder. She had done the hard part, told the truth, faced the people who doubted her, stood in a room too big for her age. But now she was shaking, not because she was scared, because sometimes courage feels heavier after it's spent. Imani didn't lecture her. Didn't say she was proud. She just sat beside her and offered her hand. The girl took it slowly. Their hands said what words couldn't. Some voices don't heal with volume. They heal with presence, with a chair pulled closer, with a breath shared, with someone saying, without needing to say, "You're not alone." In that moment, Imani didn't feel like a judge. She felt like a thread stitching dignity back into someone who'd almost had it stolen. So, if this story moved you, don't clap, echo it. If it made your chest tighten, your breath catch, your eyes sting, don't just sit with that feeling, stand with it. There's someone out there who hasn't seen their story end in justice yet. Someone who still thinks silence is safety. Someone who doesn't know that what happened in Lexington happened for them too. Stories like these don't ask for applause. They ask for memory, for emotion, for mirrors, because justice doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it walks in on tired heels. Sometimes it holds a child's hand. Sometimes it simply stays when it would have been easier to leave. And that's what remains, what matters. Not just who stood up when the world looked away, but who stayed standing after the cameras turned off, after the crowds thinned, after the moment passed. Judge Imani Rodess remained. Jalen Carter remained. And because they did, so did the truth. If you're still listening, thank you. Now echo it. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.